All right. So for the next section, we're going to talk about is the history of segregation, particularly the history from the founding of this country, particularly even before the founding of this country, from the founding of American slavery and the founding of this country as a slaveocracy, and the segregation that was enforced through law and through culture through that all the way up to 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case that supposedly outlawed, school segregation, which led to, the 60s civil rights bills outlawing, segregation as a whole. And that's generally the narrative we say is like, yeah, all that stuff existed, slavery for 246 years, but then there was an end date, and then we had segregation, Jim Crow, for another 89 years, and then there was the end date, and then we had this, since the 50s, we've been living in this, somewhat equal, society at this point. And I get what they're trying to say. I mean, people have made this graph, is trying to show that we're not that far removed from slavery. This country has spent more time enslaving people and segregating people than it has, at least the time period where everyone is considered equal under law, even if they're not treated equal. So I get that, but I really enjoy Josh Tucker created this a little bit more realistic timeline. He called it timeline of white supremacy, where yes, we had this 246 years of slavery, but that ended, but it didn't really end. It transformed into convict leasing and debt peonage, with sharecropping, and it transformed into white terrorism, felony disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, New Deal, redlining, war on drugs, to the point that, and we're still dealing with many of these things, or if we're not dealing with it, we're dealing with the outcomes, because there's never been any reparations for any of this stuff, so we're still dealing with the outcomes of some of these things that were ended, like sharecropping was ended, but inequalities in farming, and farm ownership and land ownership is still very much real. All right, so we're going to kind of just explore this, starting with slavery and then going through Jim Crow. But I want to start out with this idea about the a caste system. So actually, like Isabel Wilkerson, she really amazing author. She wrote this new book about caste that really kind of argues to kind of look at the founding of this country, not so much black and white and right, but more as like this is this system was founded as a racial caste system, in a very similar caste system. There's been a lot of caste systems in the world. The Spanish had this colonial caste system. A lot of times people will argue like racial apartheids. Apartheids that governments that have laws that are racially discriminatory. We see that in South Africa with Jim Crow. Israel, Palestine. Israel's got 60 some laws that specifically target Palestinians. So it's very similar to like the racial apartheid is also the caste system. But the example that everyone knows the most about the caste system is India has this probably one of the most ingrained caste systems you'll find in the world. And here's a chart of this caste system, and they have from untouchables or Dalit. All the way up to the top caste system, where the people kind of control the government, and that's very harshly enforced in many different ways. Legal to cultural. And this, it became really apparent. One of the things that kind of, she talks about. I want to say it inspired her for this book, but I think also she was inspired by because she wrote this really amazing book, like The Warmth of Something Suns. It was about the Great Migration and Black people escaping Jim Crow South, and just through her writings inspired her to kind of capture this system and through the perspective of the caste system. But one thing that kind of inspired her was when Martin Luther King Jr. He took he's a huge fan of Gandhi nonviolence policies and beliefs, and it was he really wanted to visit India someday, so he did in 1965, and they took him around to these different poor neighborhoods with people that were untouchables, and um, and they introduced him, Dr. King, as an untouchable himself, and he, like, immediately, like, he was reactionary. He's like, I'm not untouchable, like, he admits, he writes about how he, like, felt offended, and then I'll read this last quote that he wrote in his one of his writings. He said, "I started thinking about the fact that 20 million of my brothers and sisters were still smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. I started thinking about the fact that these 20 million brothers and sisters were still by and large housed in rat-infested, undurable slums in the big cities of our nation, still attending inadequate schools, faced with improper recreation facilities. And I said to myself, yes, I am untouchable. And every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable." And then Isabel Wilkerson, writes about. Just want to read what she wrote about that, and kind of she explained the caste system a little bit more in depth. But she writes, and as we considered and scrolled back into memories and experiences and recognition of all the things that had been restricted for both him and the 20 million other African Americans that he was fighting for, he himself, Dr. King, recognized that America had beneath its infrastructure a caste system that was not as different from India as we might like to believe. What is a caste? So caste system essentially is an arbitrary grading, an artificial graded ranking of human value in a society. And it's one in which there are fixed infrastructures that in our country predates anyone who's alive today. It goes all the way back to colonial times when the country was being formed. And the caste system essentially determines one's standing, the respect accorded to person, the benefit of doubt, access to resources, or the deprivation of access to those resources, even such things as assumptions of competence and beauty. So this is the hierarchy that we have all inherited, that no one alive created, but we have inherited, and we live under the shadow of this system. So really, like, framing it as a caste system, because the caste system is this ingrained system that even though no one's alive today who created it, it still very much, creates our society, creates our opinions, our beliefs, or internalizations, or implicit bias, and then even permeates through, access to resources and legal standings and things like that. So just one thought, as we're going through Jim Crow, I thought I really appreciate Isabel Wilkerson kind of, a different approach of looking at this, not so much as a racial hierarchy, but more of a caste system, which, have a lot of similarities as well. So early segregation. So, since the beginning, 1619, hopefully everyone knows from the 1619 project, that's when the first Africans came to colonial America. Some argue whether they were indentured servants or they were enslaved, but we all know the story. Eventually, they all became enslaved. So right off the bat, there's a lot of colonial laws. They created slave laws that basically gave, permission to slave owners to, not only permission, but encourage slave owners to segregate their slaves, segregate the black, enslaved black people from, I apologize, trying to use the word enslaved and not slaves. It's this new terminology that, in the last couple of years is, to an effort to humanize black people, because black people at this time weren't just slaves, they were human beings that were enslaved by so we need to, accurately tell the story. So I need to fix this slide, but it gave enslavers permission to segregate their enslaved people, Africans. How and it was encouraged because a lot of times enslaved black people and white indentured servants oftentimes, would unite, particularly around Bacon's Rebellion. But there was a lot of different, times where poor black and poor white people, united against the rich aristocracy. And that's really where we talked a lot about this, where the racial bribe came up, and this idea of creating this legal, class of white people that had, privileges that to kind of persuade them to join poor and rich white people against the black people and against, indigenous people. So they used a lot of slave codes, to kind of help enforce that, to help, divide the lower working classes. And what really topped that off was the Dred Scott case. So this was a case where Dred Scott was an enslaved person. To Sanford was the enslaver. Sanford, he moved everyone, including his enslaved people, to, I think it was like Wisconsin and Illinois, both free states that under law said that if you bring an enslaved person to that state, your ownership is revoked and that person becomes free. So they lived for several years in these free states, ignoring that law, and then moved back to an enslaved state. So Dred Scott actually got, I was able to get a lawyer, and he sued, saying that, technically under legal law that he should have been freed, and that there's no standing for him to continue to be enslaved. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, who was very pro-slavery, especially Chief Justice Roger Taney, basically said Black people don't have any rights in this country, free or enslaved. He said had for more than a century before regarded as being as an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations. So you can see, from that, just that tidbit, that small, bit of his decision, a lot of this was based on this idea of having this racial hierarchy, having this caste system, and that Black people were not fit to be associated with white people, and part of breaking them apart was denying the rights of Black people. And this wasn't just like we often kind of portray this that there was just these were really racist people back in the time, and then there was not racist people. But I mean, for most part, a lot of people, a lot of white people at this time, even if they had nothing against Black people, or if they opposed slavery, they still supported this racial hierarchy. They still supported segregation. Even Abraham Lincoln, who wrote, "I will say then that I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters of the Negroes or jurors, or qualifying them to hold office, or having them marry with white people. I will say in addition that there is a physical difference between white and Black races, which I suppose will forever forbid the two races living together upon terms of social and political equality. And as much as they cannot so live that while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior, that I, as much as any other man, am in favor of the superior position being assigned to the white man." And that's really, basic, because at this time, I mean, we talked a lot about, I won't get too much into this because we talked a lot about this in other classes, but when we were developing this idea of race and of Black people, in the 14, 15, 1600s, and white people in the 16, 1700s, we developed these, all these basically racist sciences and Enlightenment philosophers and eugenics and all that stuff that falsely claimed there was actually, biological differences between Black and white people, and Black people were prone to be more violent and brutes and unintelligent, and they needed white people who were biologically superior. And that the whole society rested on this hierarchy that needed the hierarchy to survive. So all that's been proven wrong. But that was a lot of people, especially people educated and enlightened people during this time, held these beliefs. And then on top of that, you have, we talked a little bit about this already, but you have this this new church, this new system of religion that I mean, it spread all over, but it was really dominating in the South during slavery period. And this was religion again, all the religions that preached equality and preached against slavery and things that like Jesus would actually want, were basically run out of town in the South. I mean, if you wanted to have a church in the South, you had to find some way to endorse slavery. And eventually, and we talked about this too with the in previous classes as well, but even going back to the 1500s, Christianity with the purity of race and the blood purity and all that stuff, started in the Spanish Inquisition as a way to demonize Jewish people and Muslims as inferior quality. So I mean, so it even started from there, and it kind of grew into this point of they brought all these philosophies that white Europeans were superior, and mixing of the blood could destroy their superior race and destroy society as a whole. And that really, they brought that stuff to them. And that really was the foundation of this new Southern religion, Baptist, evangelical religion that essentially was was used to justify Well, during slave times, it was used to justify slavery, and even afterwards, it was used to justify white supremacy through lynching and violence. Um, and this really kind of set the stage for why it pushed a lot of people towards you know justifying and perpetuating and protecting segregation. So I read this by Jamel Bowie wrote, the God of the white Southern South demanded purity embodied by the white woman. White Southerners would build the barrier with segregation, but when it was breached, lynching was the way that they would mend the fence and affirm their freedom from the moral contamination, represented by blacks and black men in particular. The perceived breach was frequently sexual, defined by the myth of a black rapist, a demon beast who set out to defile the Christian purity of the white womanhood. We cannot deny that lynching in all of its grotesque brutality was an act of religious significance justified by the Christianity of the day. Um, so again, we talked about this, but particularly, I mean, this church sold this idea that the churches in the South sold this idea that essentially the purity of the white race, the purity of Christianity, the purity of society, all rested on keeping black people, protecting white women from black people. And if we let that, if we failed, I mean, that they often talked about like that was like the most Christian thing you could do at the time was to protect white women against black people. They also preached that if they the races did mix, I mean, not only would that be the downfall of white people, the downfall of Christianity, but also the downfall of society. And that was generally the message they used, along with a bunch of other manipulated messages to help justify slavery. And then after the Civil War, they continued preaching this to help justify white supremacy, returning to the South, through lynching and voter suppression, opposing civil rights movements and things like that. So directly after the Civil War, there was basically there was presidential Reconstruction where President Johnson took over, and he was super sympathetic to the Confederates. He gave them all, pardoned all of them. Was basically returning the South to how it was, during the Confederacy. And in that day, immediately all these states passed what was called Black Codes that basically, segregated black people from economic opportunities, educational opportunities, from political opportunities, from representing themselves in court, things like that. Eventually, they only lasted a couple of years, and then we have what's called radical Reconstruction, which is essentially like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and the Radical Republicans are very opposite of today's Republicans. They passed, they basically took over power, and they passed just like almost a decade of where they passed. They tried to create a egalitarian society in the South where black people were equal, and it was a success for a while, but then white supremacy eventually, through voter suppression, violence, terrorism, convict leasing, racist criminal justice system, all these things that eventually gave the South back over to white supremacy for at least another century. But the Black Codes were essentially the start. And when radical Reconstruction was overturned, the Black Codes essentially morphed into what we call Jim Crow of today. But I want to read this Equal Justice Initiative report. Quote says, white Americans concentrated in the South and influential throughout the country conducted a widespread, organized, and determined campaign to defend their way of life against the burden of integration. Racist politicians enjoyed support from the majority of white voters. The Ku Klux Klan claimed many of the South's most prominent and powerful citizens as members, and white perpetrators of vicious attacks on black people were regularly acquitted by all white juries. White Americans committed to the myth of black inferiority used the law and violent terrorism to establish an apartheid society that relegated black Americans to second-class citizenship and economic exploitation. So then, so radical Reconstruction, there was a couple years of presidential Reconstruction where black codes and things came about, and then, radical Republicans took over. They forced the military, they forced the South, basically divided up into military sections. They threw out all the Confederates weren't allowed to rerun. They allowed, they allowed free elections and fair elections, built schools, did all this great stuff. But then it was 1877 when that officially ended, when Rutherford B. Hayes removed the military enforcing radical Reconstruction, fighting against, Southern terrorists. He removed the military as a part of a deal for him to take office. But we have a whole section on Reconstruction. If you want to learn more about that, definitely check that out. It's a really important time period. But right around, but after that, once the military left in 1877, that was basically doomed the South. Black people in the South for at least a century of white supremacy and total domination. So that and immediately we start seeing these states, they start reviving those black codes, but they call it a new thing. They call it Jim Crow. I'll read this quote. Equal Justice Initiative writes, by 1890 the term Jim Crow was used to describe the subordination and separation of black people in the South, much of it codified and much of it still enforced by custom, habit, and violence. So we really start seeing 1870s, 1880s, definitely by 1890, the entire South has some sort of Jim Crow law. And we call it Jim Crow laws. We can break apart, segregation between in two different types of segregation. De jure, which is segregation by law, meaning it's written in the law, like a Jim Crow law says black people can't go to this school and white people have to go to this school. And then there's de facto segregation that isn't written in law and no one says it out loud often, but it's a cultural norm. It's something that most white people do, and that's what we saw. We saw mainly de jure segregation in the South because of Jim Crow was mainly in the South, and then in the North and the West, they didn't have specific racist laws, but they had specific racist policies that everyone hired to like redlining and banking discrimination, housing discrimination, school discrimination, all enforced by a racial hierarchy that was enforced by police violence. So that's de facto segregation. Although we outlawed de jure Jim Crow segregation in the 60s, we still have de facto segregation, and it's still having a huge impact on this country. James Baldwin has a great quote. He said, de facto segregation means Negroes are segregated, but no one did it. Nobody did it. So that's the idea that it feels much more race neutral, or just how everything landed, how the dice rolled. It's really easy to avoid any kind of accountability or blame. But we'll kind of dive into de facto segregation more later. But we're going to spend most of the rest of the section talking about Jim Crow and de jure segregation. So de jure segregation was, local and state laws that basically legalized segregation on every aspect. I mean, this wasn't just a couple, about water fountains and here and there. I mean, this was a racial caste system where the whole point of this was to create a racial hierarchy that was enforced not only by law, but also by culture. And one of the most powerful parts of it was that it legalized black voter suppression, allowed, for all these new, voter suppression laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, all these things that, Black people were more poor and more illiterate because of, the conditions, because they were living under. So a lot of times they couldn't pass these things, these barriers, while white people were either grandfathered in or were able to pass some of these barriers. But on top of that, had terrorism and voter suppression and all kinds of things that essentially disfranchised. Starting around the 1890s, there was very few Black people in the South that were still voting. And that was after, during radical Reconstruction. I mean, they had millions of Black people voting. They had, I believe more Black politicians got elected in that time period than any other time period in this country in the South. I believe, you might want to double check that, but I mean, there was an enormous amount of Black people got elected to power, and then all of that got eliminated, and and there was another century before Black people started, getting the right to vote and getting, and able to actually elect Black people. But that wasn't just, that was in the South, but also, um, President Woodrow Wilson. I mean, here's, we have a school in D.C., Wilson High School, and there's a big movement to change the name. Because, I mean, President, Wilson was a huge advocate of Jim Crow laws. He actually, like DC's, particularly in federal government, was kind of moving away from Jim Crow, moving away from, de jure segregation. And then when he became president, he brought it all back, and he like completely desegregated, or segregated the federal government, to the point where, like, I mean, he fired millions of, or not millions, I mean, he fired like thousands of Black, federal employees. He segregated all the buildings. There's even, like, stories of, like, there are certain office buildings that just could not be completely segregated. So he built cages, literal cages around the Black employees. It was pretty awful. That's just like a few things of many things Wilson did, but we often teach Wilson as the guy who brought, world democracy after World War One, who brought in, League of Nations and all this stuff, which, on the international scale, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think he probably did some good things, but on the national scale, he was, let's just say, schools should not be named after him, for sure. But Jim Crow was about every aspect of life: political, economically, social, education, residential. It was about marginalizing Black people in every possible way. And that really, solidified in law with the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which was this case. It was very similar to, it's very similar to Rosa Parks in the bus boycott. How Rosa Parks, purposely sat in the front of the bus to start this, this whole movement and these court cases and things. Very similar. Plessy, I believe it was Plessy. I might have the name switched around, but he purposely sat into. He was a Black person, or at least he had, some portion of Black blood or ancestry, and so he, it was during the one drop rule where if you had any kind of connections with Black people, you were considered Black, and they had trains. That the trains were segregated in the South, and I think this was Louisiana. He purposely sat in a segregated cart, with the hopes of, I mean, he got arrested, and then he used that as a, to sue, saying that, Jim Crow segregation laws were unconstitutional. But what the Supreme Court, again, the Supreme Court is for the majority of this country, it's been a court that's been really focused on upholding white supremacy in many different ways. But this Supreme Court basically said, as long as, you can provide equal accommodations, it was okay to segregate. So it created that separate but equal, which is, I don't know. I mean, like, anyone that has studied this at all, I mean, hopefully everyone knows that that was a lie. I mean, there was no equality whatsoever. It was separate and very unequal. The accommodations from schools to hospitals to parks to housing, was nowhere clear, to equal. White people got the best services and access, and Black people didn't. But they pushed this idea, at least they pushed this to the majority of the country, especially people that were segregated from Black people and didn't know this was happening, or chose not to know. The general idea that segregation was okay because they were providing equal services. And then, like I said, residential, like I said, we're gonna have a whole class on next class on residential segregation, but that, housing discrimination, redlining, banking discrimination, exclusionary zoning, predatory selling, so block busting, all that stuff. So even though there was no specific laws that gave permission to all that stuff, it was still, it was still happening all over. So, and that's de facto, and that's what we're still dealing with today. we've outlawed some of this stuff, but it's really hard to outlaw a lot of this stuff, and we'll talk way more about this next class. But yeah, I want to continue focusing just on Jim Crow segregation and de jure segregation. So Nicole Hannah Jones, this is from her 1619 project, really amazing project. It was at the 400-year-old anniversary of 1619 when the first Black person, first Africans came to the colonial America. So she did this awesome podcast, essay content, essay writing. I mean, there was like 12 articles or something like that, and they were all like super profound, and I recommend reading all of them. But she writes, despite the guarantees of equality in the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court landmark Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 declared that the racial segregation of Black Americans was constitutional. With the blessing of the nation's highest court and no federal will to vindicate Black rights, starting in the late 1800s, Southern states passed a series of laws and codes meant to make slavery's racial caste system permanent by denying Black people political power, social equality, and basic dignity. They passed literacy tests to keep Black people from voting and created all-white primaries for elections. Black people were prohibited from serving on juries or testifying in court against a white person. South Carolina prohibited white and Black textile workers from using the same doors. Oklahoma forced phone companies to segregate phone booths. Memphis had separate parking spaces for Black and white drivers. Baltimore passed an ordinance outlawing Black people from moving onto a block more than half white, and white people from moving onto a block more than half Black. Georgia made it illegal for Black and white people to be buried next to one another in the same cemetery. Alabama barred Black people from using public libraries that their own tax dollars were paying for. Black people were expected to jump off the sidewalk to let white people pass and call all white people by honorific, though they received none, no matter how old they were. So it was part of the culture to Black people address white people as sir and things like that. And even some of this, so like some of this was enforced by laws, but that last one, it was more enforced by culture and not more specifically the violence and white supremacy culture, where a lot of people got lynched for just not, for small interactions that may have like challenged the racial hierarchy, such as not calling a white person a sir. In the North, white politicians implemented policies that segregated Black people into slum neighborhoods and into inferior all-Black schools, operated white-only public pools, and held white and colored days at the county fair. And white business regularly denied Black people service, placing white-only signs in their windows. States like California joined Southern states in barring Black people from marrying white people, while local school boards in Illinois and New Jersey mandated segregated schools for Black and white people. And that was a big one. I left this one out, but up until 1967, majority of U.S. states, it was illegal to have a Black person marry a white person, up until the case Loving versus Virginia. So literally, over a century after Civil War, you could get arrested and seriously fined for trying to marry someone outside your race. So we'll talk a little bit about racial segregation in healthcare, because I think, again, we really downplay what Jim Crow was in our textbooks in our high school. We really focus on water fountains and things like that. And I think healthcare is one way that we can really understand the true impact of Jim Crow. There's a really great article Jason Silverstein wrote, Being Black in America is a Health Risk, It's Time for Reparations, where he talks about reparations, but through the discrimination of healthcare over the last couple centuries, and why that alone, deserves, reparations. But he writes, Black people in the United States have, since slavery, been systemically overexposed to health risks while also being deprived of healthcare. This lethal combination continues to cause suffering and death, as well as massive and measurable loss of wealth, because it is expense to be sick in the U.S. So during Jim Crow, like I said, it wasn't just water fountains, it was hospitals and clinics. Majority of Black people could not go to majority of hospitals in the South. Most of them were reserved for white people. And even doctor, they had to oftentimes find a black doctor because white doctors and white nurses weren't allowed or chose not to, serve black people. So it was extremely hard, to find healthcare if you were black in the South during Jim Crow. And the healthcare you did find, under separate but equal was definitely not equal. It was pretty inferior healthcare and pretty inferior clinics, underfunded and lacked of trained black medical professionals. 1 in 3 hospitals in the South would not treat black people, even in emergencies. So imagine, even in an emergency, they would refuse you because of whether law or just customs. This statistic is really sad. More than 6 times as many black babies were dying of diarrhea, ammonia, than white infants in Mississippi. And that's not because of health, any biological thing. That is because 100% access to lack of access for black people in hospitals. Majority of black people, black women, had babies at home, not because they chose to, because there was no hospital close enough that would allow them to come. And infant mortality rates were just horrific at that time. And so Van R. Newkirk writes, but one of the most enduring and least noticed areas of racial segregation, even after Brown versus Board, has been healthcare. So even that, though we got rid of Jim Crow, the racial hierarchy, the racial caste, all the implicit bias, internalizations, all this stuff still continues today. And through either structurally or through, internally, through us, through doctors internalizing this stuff. So even to this day, white doctors typically feel black people are can handle more pain, and they're lying about pain to get meds and things like that. That bias is still very rampant in our doctors. But then structurally too, so this is the impacts of racial segregation, the de facto. If this was happening in the North and West, and it's now happening in the South, now they got rid of Jim Crow, is because all the neighborhoods were segregated, and all the wealth was kept and opportunities were kept in rich in white neighborhoods. So that means black people did not have access to good hospitals. I mean, or if they did have hospitals, it was more likely to be underfunded, or it was more likely to close. The treatment was worse. Less preventative care options. Poor. To the point where poor health outcomes in black communities, like black women are 3 to 4 times today are 3 to 4 times more likely to die as mothers than white mothers with the same conditions. And there's we've written a lot about this already, or we talked about this, and we'll talk about it more. But particularly around black maternity, it's just horrific in this country. The outcomes, to the point that Milwaukee, and I believe since then, several other cities have declared that racism has been so impactful with the health of black people that they actually considered racism as a public health crisis. So they officially declared it in 2019. Where they said racial health disparities have been extensively documented with it comes to like asthma, arthritis, breast cancer, kidney disease, heart failure, and lung disease, and they found there's been so much studies on it. There's been multiple really extensive studies that have calculated how many people die from lack of health coverage, and they're even able to break that down by race. In 1960, that they found that just the racial health disparities and the lack of hospital access killed over 60,000 black people a year, and by 2000 that number has reached 84,000. And 1896, black kids under 5 are 3 times more likely to die than white kids. Today, black infants are 2 times as likely to die. So even though a lot of people will say, well, we're making progress, but like Malcolm X would always say, if you put a knife in my back that's 7 inches deep and you only pull it out 3 inches, I still got it's not progress. So this is still very ingrained, and this ingrained in our society. And a big part of segregation, particularly outside of the South, was what we call sundown towns. So a lot of talked a lot about this already, and we'll talk more about the great, we call this great, whitewash term, the Great Migration, where millions of Black people, between like World War I and World War II, escaped the South, mainly going to cities, but also going all over the country. We teach it as like this was this great thing. They migrated for economic opportunity, and I mean, they were seeking economic opportunity for sure, but they were also, trying to escape I mean, they were refugees in this internal refugees. They were trying to escape the terrorism, white supremacy of Jim Crow South, that neither provided them with economic opportunities but also terrorized them to the point where there was like KKK people patrolling train stations trying to lynch people that were leaving the South. So they went all over they moved all over the country, Black people, and that's triggered a lot of towns to all of a sudden create these, sometimes they were laws, sometimes they were unofficial policies, sometimes they were just norms, but they created all kinds of different levels of segregation in these towns. A lot of them, we know a lot of this. It's not well documented, but James Lowen wrote this book, Sundown Towns. He's the same author that wrote Lies, My Teacher Told Me. And because of him, because he spent like a decade kind of like looking at all the demographics of history of demographics and populations and thousands of towns and compared it to oral histories, because a lot of times there wasn't a whole lot of written down history about these sundown towns, but he found like over 1,000, like thousands of sundown towns all over his country. And what essentially and so what essentially created sundown towns was, I mean, it was sometimes would be obvious, like they would have signs that say whites only, don't let the sun go down on you or you're gonna get lynched. And a lot of people were lynched. A lot of Black people were, because they stayed too long, or they were or bad things would happen to them. A lot of the towns, they just had enough, and they just ethnically cleansed themselves of a lot of Black people, and then had all these policies, discrimination, racial covenants, all this housing discrimination to keep Black people out. So it was a variety of different ways that they would do it, from violence to policies to just unspoken racial hierarchy that everyone was on board to enforce. And we read this one quote from James Loman. He writes, whites in about 50 towns used mob violence to expel and keep out African Americans, and many more relied on the threat of violence. Some towns passed legal ordinances banning hiring Blacks or renting or selling them homes. Others relied on citizens to pay informal visits to warn visiting African Americans that they must not remain in town. And that's essentially what there was that movie that came out, the Green Book. It's based on. I didn't actually watch it because I didn't hear great things about it, because it wasn't actually about the Black guy who wrote the Green Book. It was about this white guy, from what I heard. So I don't know, but anyway, there's this Green Book that was created by this guy. I can't remember his name, but we're about to watch a clip in a second about it. But essentially, it was a guidebook on how to navigate sundown towns, on how to, which towns were friendly to Black people and which ones you could get killed at, which restaurants were friendly, and hotels and gas stations, and which ones were basically KKK members. And so I mean, it was a pretty horrific time period for Black people, and it was surprising because I mean, you don't hear much about this. We don't talk about this, but this is literally thousands of towns were sundown towns in this country. And I found out that my hometown, I lived in a small steel town in Ohio, in between Cincinnati and Dayton, called Middletown. And I grew up, it was all white. Everyone was white. There was some Black people, but they all lived in this one affordable housing area, and and we were all segregated, and essentially everyone I knew who influenced me was white growing up. And I never really thought about it, but then I read this book and found out that that my hometown was a sundown town, and they used to have Black people, but they were all pushed out, and then or at least segregated into these concentrated poverty. And so we still see the effects today. I mean, we still see that a lot of white people are growing up in these very white towns, and that has a lot to do with sundowns. You can actually look up to see if your hometown was a sundown town or not from this this website that James Lowen created. That's got like thousands of different towns that will show you. But I want to play a quick video kind of about the Green Book and about what it was like to actually travel with these sundown towns.
Imagine you're on a road trip with your family. The year is 1954 and you're black. Segregation is law in the South and basically practiced everywhere else in America. You're traveling down the famed Route 66 and you've just reached Albuquerque, New Mexico for the first time. There's not another town for miles and you want to pull over and sleep for the night. There are over 100 motels to choose from, but less than 8 will take you in. Picking the wrong one could lead to a humiliating encounter, or worse, a violent one. But there was actually a way to know where you'd be welcome. It was in the Green Book. Americans fell in love with the idea of the road trip in the mid-20th century. A growing middle class meant more people had cars and jobs with paid vacation time. And a newly built interstate highway system meant the country was accessible to a big part of the population for the first time. The open road indicated freedom, and traveling by car reflected Americans' image of themselves: self-sufficient, curious, and spontaneous. It was a way for families to spend time together and see the expansive country they called home, to experience America's cultural and natural diversity. Through the 1950s and 60s, the highway became the most common way for American families to travel. Motels and roadside attractions sprang up along the highway to accommodate travelers needing a place to sleep or eat at any point on their journey. But that freedom didn't extend to all Americans. Black motorists were turned away from the roadside hotels, gas stations, and restaurants that had taken over the American landscape. Some places were so hostile that it was unsafe to even get out of the car. Sundown towns forcibly expelled African Americans at night, sometimes violently. Black families had to take prepared food in case they wouldn't find a restaurant that would serve them, extra gallons of gasoline in case filling stations wouldn't sell to them, and even empty coffee tins in case they couldn't access a bathroom. They carried blankets and pillows, knowing that finding a safe place to sleep could mean camping by the roadside or driving long hours into the night, even though they had money to pay for a hotel. Sometimes that distance was fatal. It was the exact opposite of the spontaneous American road trip. But thanks to a Harlem postal worker turned travel agent, knowing where to go wasn't a total shot in the dark. In 1936, Victor Hugo Green collected information on hotels, restaurants, beauty salons, and mechanic shops that would reliably serve African Americans in New York City. He called his travel guide the Negro Motorist Green Book and began publishing an updated version each year. Using his network at the United States Postal Service, which was one of the largest single employers of African Americans at the time, Green put together detailed information on businesses and private homes that would welcome Black travelers. The Green Book eventually grew to cover locations in all 50 states and sold ad space to businesses all over the country. With the help of Esso, now ExxonMobil, as a progressive corporate partner and distributor of the guides, around 15,000 copies of the Green Book started selling each year. Victor Green's once 16-page booklet ballooned to over 100 pages and became a staple item for Black families who wanted to participate in the joy of cross-country travel.
Right. And then the last couple of things I want to talk about before we start moving on to the desegregation movement after the 50s. One thing I want to talk about is just how I think a lot of times we downplay just I mean how racist this country was, and in many ways we were leading the world, particularly around racist laws. So much so that there's been a lot written lately about how the Nazis, particularly Hitler and many other had Nazis, looked at America with admiration, particularly with how we massacred the Native Americans in the West, but also how our Jim Crow laws and how we created a racial hierarchy. I mean, they actually, when they were drafting the Nuremberg laws, which are basically laws that created robbed Jewish people of their civil rights and created their own racial hierarchy with Jews and non-Jews. I mean, they analyzed Jim Crow South laws and basically borrowed a lot from them. I like this. James Q. Whitman says, the reality is that in the early 20th century, the U.S., with its vigorous and creative legal culture, led the world in racist lawmaking. That was not only true of the Jim Crow South, it was true on the national level as well. So it's particularly in the 30s and 40s, Nazis, borrowed a lot from Jim Crow, particularly around the laws that they created to kind of enforce this racial hierarchy against Jewish people. like particularly, the Nazis often expressed their admiration for the American conquest of the West, which when as Hitler declared, the settlers had shot down the millions of Redskins to a few thousand, which kind of paints a little picture about this argument about whether Redskin is a offensive word or not, or derogatory word. I mean, if Hitler's using it. I think that kind of seals the deal. That brings it, to this case. There's a really great, quote or article going around about Rachel Condor writes. I would definitely check out the whole thing. But he basically writes like, um, when it's confusing nowadays because there's so much disinformation, and not only that, the bad information makes you think the good information is wrong. So it's really hard to tell. Did Biden win, or did Trump really, or did he really steal the election? Well, I mean, most people would look at the court cases and evidence and stuff, and they would say, yeah, Biden won the election. But then you get to that realm of like, well, how all that wasn't not true, and then you get in this like cycle of what's true, not what's not true. I don't know, where's my moral compass? But he's like, he's basically like, use Nazis as a moral compass. Anytime you're not sure which side to be on, look around, and if you see a Nazi or anyone related to a Nazi on the same, be on the opposite side. Use Nazis as your moral compass. So that's a great, I really appreciate that. uh One big thing that Judith Goldstein writes, that Germany and the South shares, that Germany and the South extolled the sexual purity of white, and in German sphere, white Aryan women. Both targeted and exaggerated the threat of predatory men, blacks in the South and Jews in Germany, to justify intimidation and violence against racial enemies. So both of them were like, basically used the purity of the white women, and the need to protect these white women against black rapists and Jewish rapists, and the impurity of their bloods. They use that as justification for violence and suppression against black and Jewish people. um, so there's a lot of commonalities with this. Nazis in particular were interested in a lot, particularly certain Jim Crow laws that criminalize racial, mixed marriages, uh, racial hierarchies, dealt with other groups, like Chinese and Japanese and Philippines. Anti-miscegenation laws was a big one. U.S. This quote from James Q. Whitman: "The U.S. stood alone in the world for the harshest of its anti-miscegenation laws, which not only prohibited racially mixed marriages, but also threatened mixed race couples with severe criminal punishment. This was not a law confined to the South; it was found all over the U.S." But there's a lot of similarities with the U.S. and the South, but then particularly with what happened afterwards, after the Civil War versus what happened after World War II, we could find some differences. And Judith Goldstein writes, outlines this by saying the German government regards its years of outright racial wars with inexorable guilt, while the white South, with the sympathetic support of the Republican Party, often celebrates its Confederate and pre-civil rights past with heroic pride and nostalgia. 2011, 150 years after secession and the start of the Civil War, many Southern states celebrated the date with balls and festivities. In the distinct contrast, it's unimaginable that any reputable German political or social leaders could honor and commemorate the passage of the Nuremberg laws or the eradication of the German racist state. The consequences of accountability and reconciliation with a grievous past continue to influence contemporary events and attitudes in Germany and America. Whatever the differences and similarities, there should be no escape from the fact that these two racial states affected the 20th century in disastrous ways. Confronting the histories and legacies of our racial abyss, legacies that underline current discourse and behavior, remains imperative for both societies, especially for their younger generations in the 21st century as well. So what that's kind of outlining is, in Germany, it's it would be unthinkable, for a political party in power to be like, oh, Nazis was my heritage. I was proud, much like many people on the right, look at, our slaveocracy, our history of Jim Crow, our history of all this of slavery as like this, with pride, as your heritage. And we talked a lot about this last class in the whitewashing, the history, and the effects of that, the fact that we won't actually hold ourselves accountable. It was continuing this. But that's also up here at the Unite the Right rally. I mean, if you go to a lot of these white supremacist rallies, you'll see Confederate flags and Nazi symbols flying together. And you know, if you're not aware of all this, you could be like, well, what? That's kind of out of place. But in reality, that's basically their viewpoints are very similar, and there's a long history of partnerships between Confederates and um, Nazis. All right, so I wanted to well, I want to just point out this one more resource. Oh, sorry. So in this on this last resource, I just want to mention so Equal Justice Initiative is Brian Stevenson's organization. Um, they do they do a lot of great things. It started out as a criminal justice organizations. They defend a lot of Black people that all on death row and that are getting bad rap. I already forgot his name, but they got a whole movie out. True Mercy, I think, really great movie talking about the founding of it. But since then, they've been in this amazing organization that's done all kinds of things, from advising on public policies to working on history, and it's particularly around lynching. They have amazing reports and done a lot of history, historical preservation around our history of lynching, even to the point that they created a lynching museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And then they've also poured a lot of effort into capturing the history of our segregation. And they have a report. I mean, I think it's only like 20 pages, so it's not huge, but it's a very well done report that I recommend checking out, called Segregation in America.